Coming up on Arirang News, the South Korean economy grew faster than expected in the second quarter this year, thanks in large part to a resurgence in consumer spending, which is now almost equal to what it was before the pandemic. Consumer prices in South Korea continue to rise by more than 2.5% year-on-year. That's well above the Bank of Korea's target on more expensive groceries and fuel. And South Korea takes delivery of another 1 million doses of the vaccine from Moderna. That's part of 6 billion doses due to arrive by Sunday. Well over half of the population have now received at least one vaccine dose. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for joining us on Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. The South Korean economy in the second quarter from April to June grew faster than expected. Much of that was driven by a recovery in consumer spending, especially in the kinds of services that have taken a hit in the pandemic. Jaein has the details.
In the second quarter of this year, the South Korean economy grew more than expected. The preliminary data released by the Bank of Korea on Thursday showed the second quarter real GDP was up 0.8% on quarter. This is 0.1 percentage point higher than the earlier estimate for the April to June period. The country's economy has been growing for 4 quarters in a row. Private spending played a big role in the growth, increasing by 3.6%, the highest figure in 12 years. The central bank said private spending in the second quarter of this year was at around 98% of what it was during the fourth quarter of 2019 before the start of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Growth in private spending in the second quarter of this year was largely driven by the rise in face-to-face services, including restaurants and leisure that had been directly hit by the surge in infection in the previous quarters.
The central bank official added that it was also led by a rise in spending for semi-durable goods such as clothing. Finance Minister Hong Nam-ki expressed his delight for the better-than-expected growth, posting on social media that South Korea's rate of the economic recovery is fastest among all the world's 10 largest economies. But one expert says the economic recovery depends on the COVID-19 situation.
If the COVID-19 situation worsens, there's a possibility that this recovery in spending will not last. Also, the country's economic recovery going forward will depend on how the pandemic and the global economic recovery unfold.
The central bank has maintained its 4% growth target for this year, with the second quarter economic growth surpassing the rate that the country needs to achieve that goal. Jaein, Arirang News.
South Korea's consumer prices in August were up 2.6% from a year earlier, which was the same rate of increase as the month before. That's well above the Bank of Korea's target, and the rise was largely due to grocery and fuel prices. Min Soo-kyun reports.
South Korea's consumer prices in August jumped 2.6% from a year earlier, the same on-year growth posted in July. According to Statistics Korea on Thursday, the consumer price index last month stood at 108.29. Consumer prices have seen on-year rises of between 2 and 3% for 5 straight months. There were several factors behind the rising prices.
Consumers' prices rose by 2.6% on year as prices of personal services, oil and agriculture, livestock and fisheries products continued to grow.
Prices of agricultural, livestock and fishery products rose 7.8% on year. The price of eggs soared almost 55%, while spinach rose 35% and pork climbed 11%. The government vowed to step up efforts to stabilize prices before the Chuseok holiday, as demand for farm products such as vegetables and eggs tend to rise during that period. In August, industrial product prices were up 3.2% from a year earlier, posting the biggest rise in more than 9 years due to rising oil and raw material prices. Gasoline, diesel and LPG were all up by more than 20%, higher than in July. The price of services, including housing expenses, was also up 1.7%. Notably, the cost of rent increased by 1.6%, its biggest rise in 4 years. Last week, the Bank of Korea revised this year's inflation outlook to 2.1% from an earlier forecast of 1.8%. Min Suk-hyun, Arirang News.
The South Korean government is going to raise the premium for employment insurance next July because the surge in claims in the pandemic has put the fund at risk of depletion. All regular employees have to contribute if they're working more than 15 hours a week and can claim the benefit for several months if they lose their job. The Labor Ministry said Wednesday that the monthly premium will be increased by 0.2 percentage points from the current 1.6% to 1.8%. The rise is expected to contribute an additional 3 trillion won to the fund next year, roughly $2.6 billion US. This will be the second increase under the Moon administration. The Labor Ministry says unemployment claims soared by about 45% in 2020 from the year before. President Moon Jae-in says South Korea's move to end the payment monopoly of global tech giants in the app market will become an international norm. The South Korean parliament earlier this week passed a bill that bans Apple and Google from forcing app developers to use their built-in payment systems, becoming the first country in the world to introduce such a law. President Moon said the move is something to be proud of, and he called on the government to prepare the necessary decrees to enforce it. Apple and Google have been criticized for requiring developers to use their in-house payment systems while charging up to 30% commission. Developers will be able to direct users to alternate payment platforms. And Apple is now going to allow some apps to include links directing users to external websites to make payments, enabling them to bypass the tech giant's in-app commissions. This is Apple's second major concession to app developers in a week, as regulators zero in on what they see as a monopolistic practice. The company said Thursday, following an investigation in Japan, that it'll allow payment links inside apps that display subscription content like Netflix and Spotify. The decision applies worldwide. And it goes a step further from last week when Apple said it would let apps send payment links outside the apps, but not in the apps themselves. The oil-producing countries of OPEC and its allies have decided to stick with a gradual increase in production next month, citing what they see as stronger market fundamentals. Oil prices, though, holding relatively steady today. Kim Sung-min reports.
The Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries and its allies led by Russia on Wednesday agreed to stick to their existing policy of gradual oil production increases. The agreement was reached during an online ministerial meeting where ministers ratified a 400,000 barrel per day supply increase for next month. The member states had agreed earlier in July to phase out record output cuts by adding 400,000 barrels per day on a monthly basis. The group said in a statement that while there is ongoing uncertainty posed by the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, market fundamentals have strengthened and recovery is accelerating. The decision was made a day after OPEC Plus revised up its forecast for 2022 oil demand growth to 4.2 million barrels per day from its previous 3.28 million barrels per day, suggesting that there could possibly be an output increase in the future. Wednesday's decision also comes despite continuous pressure coming from the U.S. to raise production more quickly. The U.S. has been calling for faster output increases by the group as benchmark Brent crude traded above $70 per barrel, close to multi-year highs. After the announcement, oil prices steadied on Wednesday, Brent crude falling 4 cents to around $71.60 a barrel, and U.S. West Texas Intermediate rising 9 cents to some $68.60 a barrel. Kim Sung-min, Arirang News.
Time now for an in-depth look at the market news this afternoon, and for that I'm joined on the line by Dr. Kim Se-won, Professor of Economics at Ewha Women's University. Professor Kim, good afternoon. Thank you for making time today.
Good afternoon, Devin.
Well, let's start with the U.S. housing market, Professor, where the National Home Price Index was up in June by the most in 30 years, up 18.6%. This is actually the third month in a row that figure set a record, and the rise was even more in the big cities. Of course, we've seen prices rise here in Korea too, but what's driving that move in the U.S.?
Soaring home prices shattered another record in June, and it becomes another reason for U.S. Fed to begin tapering sooner or later. The representative U.S. housing market index, S&P Case-Shiller Index, increased by 19% on year in June. Strong demand for house generated by COVID pandemic and ample liquidity with the lowest level mortgage rate boosted up U.S. home prices and rents, particularly in big cities over West and East Coast. Home prices are expected to continue to surge due to strong demand and persistent demand on housing. Because it takes 3 to 4 years to provide new houses, it won't be easy to increase house supplies in the short run. In this wild U.S. housing market, Fed has been purchasing $40 billion of mortgage-backed securities as a way of providing liquidity to the economy. It means that if Fed begins the tapering, it might help to stabilize U.S. housing market.
Right. It does strengthen the case for tapering. Others pointing out, of course, as you did, that there could be backed up demand for a very small number of houses on the market because of the pandemic. But, you know, that had an influence on Wall Street perhaps on Wednesday, where stocks were mixed. There was a gain on the S&P and the NASDAQ rose to a new high. Another factor, perhaps U.S. payrolls for August coming in well below expectations. What's the story in the global markets?
U.S. stocks wavered yesterday, but the NASDAQ jumped to a record to start the month, building on the strong gains from the August. Tech-heavy NASDAQ added by 0.3%. Also, S&P 500 has climbed for 9 of the past 10 months, and this near its all-time record. The S&P 500 gained by less than 0.1%. However, the Dow Jones Industrial slipped by 0.1%, mainly due to disappointing labor market news, which added only 370,000 new jobs to U.S. economy. Actually, as you said, Devin, this is much less than market's expectation, only 50% of the market expectation. But Dow Jones Industrial's decline is limited because this weak labor market situation can delay tapering of the U.S. Fed. European markets are quite mixed because of different signals from U.S. economy.
And today, Korean stocks were mixed too. The cost beat down quite a fair bit as foreigners returned to selling local shares. We saw a decline in shares of Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix, both chip makers. The Kosdaq, though, eking out a slight gain. Tell us about the domestic market.
Domestic market was also mixed between Kospi and Kosdaq today. As more data shows U.S. economy recovery is delayed, quite a few cyclical stocks in Kospi declined. Particularly foreign investors, 2 straight days net purchase has been stopped today. Foreign investors and institutional investors together sold about 1 trillion won, which is a huge amount today. Kospi slipped in a large scale by 1% today, but Kosdaq gained by 0.1% thanks to individual investors large by up to about 150 billion won purchased.
And now the latest news on the growth forecast for South Korea. We heard just a minute ago that it came out quite good for the second quarter, and the ratings agency Moody's has boosted its forecast for the year from 3.5% now to 4%, a boost for next year too. Tell us about that and what was behind the decision.
A major rating corporation, Moody's, revised up Korea's economic growth forecast for this year to 4%, mainly on strong export. In its report on World Economic Outlook, the rating agency adjusted Korea's gross domestic product growth outlook from its previous estimate of 3.5% in May. Moody's says the nation's growth will continue to be supported by high demand across the globe for industrial products, especially memory chips and chemical products. Moody's also revised Korea's growth outlook for next year from previous 3% to 3.2%. And they added that they expect a strong recovery in the country in the next year. So Moody's economic growth forecast of 4% for this year became very close to that of Korean government, 4.2%.
Right, and just to clarify for our viewers, as you said, Professor, the 4% forecast is for 2021. They may have seen on the screen below saying 2022, but it's the 4% for this year. And now finally, Professor, Korea last month, we saw consumer prices up by more than 2% from a year earlier, more than 2.5% in fact, and that was the 5th month in a row that we've seen that figure above 2%. Prices up for rents, groceries, eggs in particular, the so-called eggflation. What do you see happening with consumer prices right now?
Against the government and Bank of Korea's previous expectation, consumer price rose more than 2% for 5th straight month in August. This price level up is mainly due to high prices of agriculture and oil products, indicating a continued buildup of inflationary pressure in the middle of economic recovery from previous pandemic. And since these items are almost imported from foreign countries, it is very difficult for Korean government to control the inflation. The consumer price rose 2.6% in August from a year earlier, the same growth as the previous month. Compared with a month earlier, consumer inflation rose by 0.6% last month, accelerating from 0.2% on month in July. The core inflation, which excludes volatile food and oil prices, rose 1.3% on annual basis in August. So if the inflation pressure continues upward in September and October, the possibility that Bank of Korea raises interest rates one more time earlier in the middle of November rises.
Yeah, this certainly does appear to make that a more likely scenario, Professor. We'll have to leave it there for today. Thank you, as always, for sharing your insights with us. We appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.
South Korea this afternoon took delivery of another 1 million doses of the Moderna vaccine. Those are part of the 6 million due to arrive by Sunday. Also just a few hours ago, another 500,000 doses of the Pfizer coronavirus vaccine. Now the local health authorities today moved to address rumors that the vaccines can cause leukemia, assuring the public that there is no evidence to suggest that's the case. Choi Min-jung reports.
South Korea received more than 1 million doses of the Moderna vaccine on Thursday. According to health authorities, this is part of the 6 million doses of the vaccine scheduled to arrive in the country before the end of the weekend. In August, Moderna notified health authorities of a delay in supply, putting a dent in the government's target to give first doses to at least 70% of the population by September. However, the government has said the arrival of the vaccines this week means it's still on track to reach that goal.
Moderna vaccines will arrive in batches, and we expect that sufficient quantities will be supplied so that vaccinations can be carried out without any difficulties.
So far, over 29 million people, or 57.4% of the population, have received their first shots. More Pfizer vaccines have arrived in South Korea as well. Over 526,000 doses landed at Incheon International Airport on Thursday afternoon. This is part of the 1.5 million doses the government purchased from Romania through vaccine cooperation. Meanwhile, after consultations with the Korean Society of Hematology, health authorities announced that there is no evidence that COVID-19 vaccines cause leukemia.
There's no need to worry about getting leukemia after receiving COVID-19 vaccines. Please get the COVID-19 vaccinations for your own health.
Experts added that there has been no report of causality between existing vaccines and leukemia. This comes after some people in South Korea have been voicing concerns over people reportedly getting leukemia after being vaccinated against COVID-19. Choi Min-dong, Arirang News.
And more on the coronavirus situation here in South Korea. On Thursday, the country reported 1,961 new cases. More than 70% of those are in the Seoul area. And with the Chuseok holiday coming up this month, there's a chance the authorities could ease the rules on private gatherings. Chae Won-jong has the latest.
South Korea's capital region has seen more than 70% of the country's daily cases for 3 days in a row. Gyeonggi province alone saw nearly 700 cases on Thursday. Seoul saw 559 and Incheon had 123. The country as a whole saw 1,961 cases on Thursday, with all but 34 being local transmissions. Despite slight lower cases compared to the previous day, the figure is still 79 higher than a week ago. Across the country, the more transmissible Delta variant is worrying health authorities, especially as more people are expected to travel during the upcoming Chuseok holiday. And that is why this Friday, the authorities are set to announce special prevention guidelines as well as social distancing measures. However, in some areas, the authorities are considering whether to ease the restrictions for in-person visits at nursing hospitals and nursing homes, as well as relax guidelines for family gatherings. The authorities also said they have discussed the possibility of allowing fully vaccinated people to have private gatherings of up to 4 people after 6 p.m. at places other than coffee shops and restaurants. Chae Won-jong, Arirang News.
In other news, the South Korean Defense Ministry has unveiled a plan to bolster its missile capabilities and expand the use of advanced technology. As part of a spending plan for the next 5 years, soldiers themselves will be equipped with smart technology, in part to make up for an expected decline in manpower. Lee Kyung-eun reports.
The Defense Ministry has decided to inject some $272 billion for 2022 to 2026 to build a smarter and stronger military. That's an increase of some $12 billion from what was reported last year for the 5-year plan. This comes amid a dwindling young population, which calls for a structural change that reduces manpower and expands the use of the more efficient technologies and weapons to make up for them. Much of the efforts will go into bolstering its missile defense capabilities. The ministry said it will develop stronger, longer range and more precise missiles to keep peace on the peninsula. It added that the missiles will be capable of destroying enemies' tunnels and buildings with increased accuracy. And to better detect external threats, it will deploy additional missile early warning radar systems and strengthen its surveillance capabilities. There are also new ambitions in the space sector, like deploying a new radar system to monitor space objects, a military surveillance satellite, and ultra-small satellites. For the Navy, the country will build more 3,000-ton or larger submarines with advanced operational and combat capabilities. In a bid to go smart, augmented reality and virtual reality will be used for mock drills and training centers. And drones and robots will be actively used by combat troops. With the increased efficiency and power of combat capabilities, the ministry will reduce the size of the manpower in general, while increasing the number of experienced senior soldiers who are more skilled at using advanced equipment. Lee Kyung-eun, Arirang News.
Members of the U.S. House of Representatives are reportedly pushing to include South Korea and 3 other countries in the so-called Five Eyes intelligence sharing program involving America and its allies. A subcommittee suggested the expansion in next year's National Defense Authorization Bill, citing the need to better deal with the rise of China and Russia. As it stands, the Five Eyes are the U.S., Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the U.K. The draft bill suggests adding South Korea, Japan, India, and Germany. However, there need to be more consultations and voting procedures within Congress involving the Senate if it's to become law. The White House also needs to agree for it to be finalized. The EU is expressing deep concerns over signs North Korea may have rebooted its main nuclear reactor that's used to produce atomic bombs. Officials say the North should accept the offers for talks from South Korea and the U.S., pointing to the recent IAEA report that suggests the regime has restarted the reactor. An EU spokesperson urged North Korea to abandon its nuclear program in a complete, verifiable, and irreversible way. The EU also urged the North to allow IAEA inspectors inside the regime in order to fulfill its requirements under the Non-Proliferation Treaty as a non-nuclear weapons state. Brussels also pledged to support efforts to resolve the issue diplomatically. And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.